Christmas is time for family, but in South Africa, tens of thousands of forgotten children are in institutional care. For these children, the time of the year brings pain and sorrow. The story of James, Sky and Ezekiel, 3 children from different provinces of different ages, genders and races, show that even the best institutions can never replace family care. For more on this, we are joined by Robyn Wolfson Vorster, who's a children's rights activist. Robyn, a pleasure to have you on the program this afternoon. Now, the experiences of James, Sky and Ezekiel, how prevalent are cases like these here in South Africa?
Well, thank you for having me on the show, Nhlanhla, and good afternoon to your viewers. Unfortunately, very prevalent. I've written 7 of these articles at Christmas time over the last many years, and although the names change, the stories change, the details, ages change, there are just so many children for whom Christmas is a very, very unhappy time because they are either in institutional care or they're in abusive family relationships without the opportunity of being safe over Christmas. Or alternatively, they're in a place where they would love a family, but that family has been withheld from them because of bureaucratic hurdles.
So the Hague Convention emphasizes the importance of children growing up in a family environment for their full and harmonious development. How can South Africa then align its own practices with the principles outlined in this convention to really prioritize permanent family care?
Well, there are a number of interventions that we need to put in place. The first thing that we need to do is we need to ensure that if children stay in their primary family care, so in their biological families, which is definitely first prize for them, those family environments are safe for them. So what we need to do is ensure that we have sufficient social workers in this country, which we know is an ongoing problem, to be able to ensure that when children are at risk, they can be removed from those at-risk situations as quickly as possible to save their lives, but also to save them from the trauma that's involved with being an at-risk child. Then what we need to do is we need safe places for those children if they are removed. And ideally, that shouldn't be institutionalization, but if they do need to be in a child and youth care center, which people might not be familiar with the term, but that's what we call a children's home in this country, then it should be a short stay where they can be taken care of before they're put into more permanent family care. And so what we need to be able to say is if those children are not in a place where they can be reunited with their biological families, they need to be put into other family care and as quickly as possible. And what we particularly need to be able to do in order to adhere to our treaty, our Hague Convention requirements, is to ensure that that is permanent family care. So what we often do in this country is we'll place children into temporary foster care or into long-term institutionalization. And that certainly studies have shown that that is not the best option for vulnerable children. They need to be in family care for the long term wherever possible.
So the recent court ruling highlighting the conflict between the Convention, African Charter, and also the Hague Convention, how do you envision a more balanced approach that considers both national forms of care and inter-country adoptions without really compromising the best interests of the child?
So it's really interesting. There has been some talk for a long time, and I wish the government would be more transparent about its adoption policies. But unfortunately, we get very little comment from them about what they actually believe about adoption. But quite recently, their national practice guidelines have come under scrutiny with regards to adoption. And in fact, they were declared unconstitutional in a recent court case. And the government was told to set them aside. And the reason for that is because we know that according to our constitution, the best interest of a child has to be our priority at all times. And often what we're doing in this country is we're prioritizing, yes, culture and yes, race, which we know is very important for children and for their identities as they grow up. But we certainly should not be prioritizing that over relationships and over the opportunity for children to be taken care of. And often, and we have very, very small adoption rates in this country. Our last statistics that we had were from 2020 and 2021, where we had 850 adoptions in that year, and only 50 of those were intercountry adoptions. So we are not placing a lot of children into permanent family care. But what we know is that actually there are many children who could really benefit from that. And what the court rulings have done is they have emphasized that, in fact, even when that is not biological family, family itself is better than institutional care.
So the Department of Social Development's practice guidelines have faced a lot of criticism and also legal challenges for being unconstitutional. What changes or reforms do you believe are necessary within the Department of Social Development to really ensure that the best interests of the child are truly paramount in adoption cases?
I think that there's a balance which is required. Like I said, I do believe that biological family and extended family is incredibly important for children. And when they are safe in those environments, then they should remain in those environments. And if there is a family member who is willing to adopt a vulnerable child, then certainly they should have first preference. But what we do need to do is look very seriously at the policy which says that it's better for a child to be in an institution or even in temporary foster care than it is for them to be adopted. And I think that is incredibly problematic because we do see long-term issues in those children's lives, problems where they struggle to adapt, where at the age of 18 they suddenly become independent, and we know that 18-year-olds are not grown-ups. They're not ready to take care of themselves. And without that sense of permanency that comes from being adopted, from having a name, the possibility of inheriting, but also just that long-term family care, which is so incredibly important for children's well-being. So what we need the department to do is to actively look at why that court judgment came out, where they are not taking care of the best interests of children, and to also ensure that when there is a case, that they look at it on a case-by-case basis. Because often what we have is we've got blanket policies that apply to all children. But actually each situation is individual. And one of the stories which I wrote about was the story of a little boy who knew only one family his entire life. And he's loved them for 7 years, but he can't currently adopted by them because they are from a foreign country and our country doesn't have a treaty with their country for inter-country adoptions. So these are hurdles and obstacles that have been placed in the way of children, which are understandable because we want to protect them. But at the same time, we need to ensure that what we do is we make our policies and practices work for them as opposed to them being beholden to our policies and practices.
So Sky's case brings attention to the challenges faced by children exhibiting unlucky behaviors, like you mentioned, as a response to trauma. How can institutions then better understand and support such children to avoid punitive measures and provide a conducive environment for healing?
So the term unlucky behaviors is one that a lot of people are not familiar with, but it's something that my colleague Nhlanhla speaks about a lot. And the reason that he speaks about it is because often the children who come and see him are children who exhibit what he refers to and what psychologists refer to as unlucky behaviors. So the idea is that when a child is traumatized, they often respond to that in one of two ways. That way might be depression, anxiety, self-harm, being more dependent on adults, and often we're very sympathetic towards those children. But the children with unlucky behaviors respond to the same trauma in a very different way, and often that is with violence, with anger. Those are the children that, as Luke says, those are the children that throw rocks at your car. And it's very hard to be sympathetic towards those children. But that is a very natural response to trauma, and it's a very natural response to long-term institutionalization. So for us to be punishing those children for what is natural and normal, not adaptive, not right, we don't want that behavior, but we need to be ensuring that the people who take care of those children really do understand those behaviors and are able to respond to them in ways that are just different and more sympathetic. And what we never want to do, and what we saw in Sky's case, which is really, really concerning, is that the CYCC that she was in is effectively punishing her for her choices as a child by removing care from her and giving her no exit program. And unfortunately, institutionalized children often end up really making very unwise decisions. They're the ones who end up homeless, in prostitution, abusing drugs or alcohol. And what we always want is to understand that no matter what the child's choices when they were a child, we need to support them into adulthood.
Ezekiel's story is also quite an interesting one and involves bureaucratic hurdles and the delays in considering inter-country adoption, like you mentioned. But what systematic changes are needed to really streamline the adoption process and ensure that decisions are made promptly?
So inter-country adoptions in particular are extremely hard in this country. And, again, there's reasons behind that. We don't want children to go into unsafe environments. And we also don't necessarily want children to grow up in other countries if there are options for them in South Africa. But as I mentioned earlier, those statistics are a bit scary. We just do not have adoptive families coming forward in South Africa. And if that is the case, then we need to ensure that if there are families that are willing to take care of those children overseas, that once they are screened, we expedite the process of placing those children into their family care. And one of the reasons why this is so important is because a lot of the children who end up in inter-country adoptions are either older, and they're children who wouldn't find a family in South Africa because they happen to be 2 or over, and most children who are adopted locally are adopted under the age of 2, or alternatively, they are children with special needs. And often those children can get expert family care and expert medical care overseas, and yet they're languishing in children's homes where we are under-resourced, understaffed, are not in a place to be able to take care of those children. So what effectively we are calling for is for government to be able to say that although we need to put the treaties in place where we understand that we're going to work with a country that is going to put children into a safe environment and there's going to be follow-up, but once that is in place, then we need to make sure that those inter-country adoptions happen as quickly and effectively and efficiently as possible. Because a year or 2 years in a child's life is immense. And many of these children are spending 7, 8, even longer than that years in institutional care before they can become part of a family.
Robyn, as we approach the holiday season, how can individuals, communities and policymakers alike contribute to making a positive impact on the lives of vulnerable children and also ensuring that they experience joy and a sense of belonging during Christmas?
So we actually have incredibly caring people in South Africa, and often the children who are invisible during the year actually become visible at Christmas time. There are lots of people who do Christmas parties for them and take them presents, and we've got Santa's shoebox and lovely initiatives. The problem is that unfortunately those children then become invisible for the rest of the year. And so what we would need is for people to step forward to support child and youth care centres. Often they are literally on the brink of closure. And I know of 2 that have closed in the last couple of months in the Gauteng province. So support them there. We also really need people to step forward to provide temporary safe care, foster care, and ideally adoption. And although a lot of the problems with adoption come from the bureaucratic hurdles, to a large extent it's also because we don't have families coming forward and saying they would love to give a child a family. And I think that it's a huge thing that people need to be considering. And then we kind of hope, the article unfortunately characterized the DSD as being the Grinch that stole Christmas, and we don't want that. We want the people who are tasked with the social welfare of our children really to be intent on making sure that they take care of their best interests. And that, from the looks of things, is going to require a big rethink of their adoption policies in the year to come. And I trust that that's something that they will do intentionally. And if not, unfortunately, I think this is going to end up in court once again, because in the end, we have to prioritize the best interests of these children.
Now, Robyn, we have run out of time, but before I let you go, and also looking forward, what initiatives or advocacy efforts do you believe could really bring about meaningful change in the way that South Africa addresses the care and adoption of vulnerable children?
So there's been a long-term process of amending our Children's Act, which I think could benefit from some thoughts about how to make the adoption process speedier and more efficient. I think from the DSD's perspective, there is a lot that they could consider. And I think that it is important for people in society to put some pressure on them. And I think also we need to be holding them accountable for situations like little James's situation, where he was abandoned at school at age 7 and he still doesn't have a family at age 11. He's still in an institution. And why is that? I'm certain that somebody could come forward and provide him with a lovely family environment. So I do think that there's a point of personal accountability that we also need to hold ourselves to, that says these children can no longer be invisible, and we as a society need to make sure that they are properly cared for, and wherever possible, they grow up in families.
As we wrap up this insightful discussion with Robyn Wolfson Vorster, who is a passionate children's rights activist, it's quite clear that challenges facing South Africa's vulnerable children demand urgent attention, as well as systematic changes as well.